Hello, I'm Mr Craven, Senior Director of English for NET, and this is the first of two quick talk-throughs on the theme of money and wealth in A Christmas Carol. Now let's start by clearing something up. For a lot of modern readers, A Christmas Carol is seen as reflecting the ideological tension between capitalism on one side and socialism on the other. The problem is, it's more nuanced and rather more complicated than that. In terms of social context, the idea of capital, which is of wealth, business, trade, of investment, now that idea was common at the time the novel was written, but the modern understanding of capitalism and socialism as oppositional ideologies in society, well, that can be traced back to Karl Marx's Das Kapital. Now, that wasn't published until 1867. Now, this means that the idea of capital as a negative social construct in which a bourgeois society oppresses, represses, suppresses, and exploits the proletariat, and so on, well, that idea has to be applied retrospectively and to the intentions of an author for whom those ideas didn't exist in their current form. Dickens, for all his social sympathies, wouldn't have understood what we mean by a socialist perspective, although that doesn't mean that there can't be some valid resonances. Now, money was important in Victorian society. Children in schools at all levels were taught about how fortunate they were to live in a time of such prosperity and progress, something that must have been mildly confusing for those in the so-called ragged schools set up by some well-meaning philanthropists for the education of the poor children, those children who were literally wearing ragged clothes, hence ragged schools. Now, even more than this, the 1840s were known as the Hungry Forties, and that was thanks to an economic depression which was causing misery amongst the British poor. That was due to a trade slump in 1839, due to a steep increase also in unemployment, and several years of bad harvests, all of which sort of wove together into this web of poverty and misery. Now, the middle and upper classes weathered that economic storm reasonably well. The poor, not so much. Now, money was seen as a measure of success, both individually and collectively. To be wealthy was to embody the Victorian work ethic and to validate the common view of Britain as superior in every way. Culturally, militarily, economically, morally. Yes, our modern understanding of the period is increasingly more nuanced. Despite the hungry 40s, in large part the Victorian economy was strong. Now, for most of the period, the pound was riding high, labour was cheap, trade and the strength of the empire meant that imported food was becoming increasingly inexpensive, and a wider range of goods was becoming available, for those who were able to afford them, at least. Now, with the increase in trade and opportunity, the middle classes expanded enormously during the 19th century, with luxury in terms of food, clothes, toys, cutlery, silverware, glassware, and china, much more available at a much more reasonable price than previously. And that's thanks in no small part to the improved effectiveness and efficiency of manufacturing on an industrial scale. Now, the strength of the economy was seen as a cause, as a consequence, and as a validation of the Victorian social model. And it was also seen as existing hand in hand with the empire. London, which was the key setting of A Christmas Carol, was the largest financial centre in the world. And Britain, more widely, was known as the workshop of the world. And that's because Britain was exporting its mechanical and its mass-produced goods across continents, and it was seen as leading the world in terms of improvements to manufacturing processes and organisation. So far, so mostly positive. There were, however, concomitant costs attached to all of this. And the increasing inequality and inequity within society was probably the most visible. Rates of poverty increased dramatically during the Victorian era, and that's thanks to the centralised population, the growth of cities, to population growth, to low wages, and also to the shift from established cottage or agrarian industries in rural areas to less dependable factory employment in cities. Now, if to be rich was to be seen as a success, to be poor was the reverse of that. It was to be seen as lacking effort, to be lacking industry, to be burdened by the disapproval of God, to be un-British, to be a drain on society, to be morally unfit and essentially criminal. Now, don't forget, the parents who had to go into workhouses were separated from their children. In a sense, if you're poor in Victorian society, it's seen as being your fault. And there's very limited access to any kind of support. The poor laws that Scrooge references were intended to provide for the poor, but essentially, the poor were simply placed in workhouses or prisons, as Scrooge points out in Stave 1. Now, this means that money, any money, needed to be earned, and that links to the Victorian ideal of self-sufficiency. Now, at this point, let's introduce Charles Dickens. Now, Dickens was, it seems, inspired to write A Christmas Carol by visiting his sister in Manchester. Now, his sister was called Fan, which of course has some wider resonances in the novel. Now, while he was there, he witnessed the extremes of child poverty and of child employment, and that includes the awful conditions within the factories and the mills. Now, Dickens also toured some Cornish tin mines in the same year, and he was horrified by the conditions faced by children who were working there. Dickens also visited a ragged school in London, which was catering for the largely illiterate and often illegitimate street children. Dickens had, in addition, read a parliamentary report on child employment. And with all those influences in play, he abandoned some early plans which had been to write a pamphlet on the issue. And instead, what he did was, he wrote A Christmas Carol. And that was in a really intense period of about 6 weeks. Now, Scrooge, as the protagonist, is, unsurprisingly, intended to be viewed as representing the problems in society from a financial perspective. Now, Scrooge is wealthy, clearly, but it's a question of the purpose of his acquisition of wealth, and also the application of that wealth when it's been accumulated. Scrooge at the beginning is a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. He's a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Scrooge's focus is not on sympathy or on generosity, it's on gaining money. And notice in that last one there that the semantic field that's being built is almost entirely focused on taking from others or on exploiting the weakness of others. Now, that focus on the obsessive control and accumulation of money is also evident in the small fire, and that's, of course, with its various other symbolic applications in terms of sympathy and so on. It's also there in the coal box that Scrooge controls. Darkness, remember, is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. Now, Scrooge views everything, including Christmas, through the lens of cost. Christmas, Scrooge says, is a time for paying bills without money, of being not an hour richer, and of balancing your books. Even people are defined through their financial value. They're part of an economic calculation. If you turn to Thomas Malthus, for example, where if they would rather die, they would at least decrease the surplus population. Now, as the Ghost of Christmas Present notes, the faulty assumption underpinning all of this is of the value of a life being defined by social class. Scrooge is, in the image used, he is the insect on the leaf. The Cratchits and those who are like them are his hungry brothers in the dust. Phrased another way, if we turn to Fred from Stave 1, the poor should be seen as fellow passengers to the grave, rather than another race of creatures bound on other journeys. Now, Scrooge has, it seems, experienced poverty, just as had Dickens. Now, when Scrooge is seen with Belle as a younger man, there are already signs of care and avarice. He's got a greedy, restless motion in the eye. And he defends himself with claims that there is nothing on which the world is so hard as poverty. And Belle notes that Scrooge's obsession is with being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. Now, Scrooge's fears, note, while they're still theoretically financial, are actually linked to his fear of judgment, his fear of rejection. The solitary child neglected by his friends back in Stave 2 has turned to money as a means of insulation against, of protection against, of control over the world around him. Now Bell, in contrast, talks of being poor and content to be so until, in good season, we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. Now Bell represents very much the worthy ideal of a Victorian and of a Christian work ethic, to begin young and poorer, and then through time and independent effort to improve their worldly fortune, both literally in terms of money and also figuratively in terms of lifestyle. The mistake that Scrooge has made is in beginning to worship gain as a golden idol, and that's to borrow Bell's image. It's a reference to the Israelites' worship of the golden calf in Exodus, essentially straying from the true faith to the worship of idols. Now the instruction, "Thou shalt not covet," is the most common translation of one of the 10 Commandments listed biblically throughout the book of Exodus and also the book of Deuteronomy. But there's also a commandment against idolatry, to have no other gods before me. And that's listed in Leviticus as an injunction to make you no idols nor graven image. Scrooge's worship of a golden idol is therefore a double transgression: the worship of money and the desire to acquire money from others. Now Scrooge is clearly a covetous old sinner, as we're told in Stave 1, and an audience would have been very much aware of those Christian resonances. Scrooge had seen money as a means to happiness with Bell, and his worship had been, it implies, of Bell, of love. Instead, money has now become, rather than a means to an end, it's become the end in itself. Now that's also the key sin committed by Marley: covetousness, the acquisition of wealth for the sake of wealth. "You're always a good man of business," Scrooge comments to his old friend, and there's a nod there also back to that early description of Scrooge as being an excellent man of business on the day of Marley's funeral. There's a clear prioritising there of money over people. But that focus on monetary acquisition is also the basis of the chain that Marley wears. It's made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses. Money, yes, but also the restriction and the control of money. It's not simply about gaining money, it's about limiting the access to wealth for others. In a sense, this is a reflection of the changing view of economics at the time, away from simply individually acquiring money and seeing resources as finite and limited, Malthus again, and moving towards the idea of building the economy and therefore building capacity, and thereby building also the general or the commonwealth. A rising tide lifts all ships, and so on. It's also noticeable that Scrooge's fear of poverty, of the world, to quote Bell, also translates into a fear of the poor. When Scrooge is presented with ignorance and want in Stave 3, they are described as wolfish. That's animalistic, predatory, creatures who live and hunt in packs. Now, wolves have been extinct in the UK for several centuries by the time the novel is written, but bounties were still in place in a number of parts of the various countries within the UK. And wolves were also still associated with, in a cultural sense, with a thread of uncontrolled nature and of predation. And notice also that these are man's children. They're the social result of the selfish and the acquisitive behaviour of Scrooge and those like him. Now, this damaging social impact and its predatory result is also evident in the description of Mrs. Dilber, the charwoman, of the laundress and of the undertaker's man in the low-browed beetling shop in Stave 4, where these are all selling items to Old Joe. In a comparable sense, these are also wolfish, predatory characters. They're defining the dead man as simply a resource to be exploited, something to be scavenged from. He's defined by them in terms of the profit he can bring them. Now, it's made clear by the laundress, because the dead man, Scrooge, we realise, because he wasn't natural in his lifetime, Because every person has a right to take care of themselves, and he always did, it's reasonable to exploit him for whatever gain they can. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive, to profit us when he was dead, she notes. In a sense, in a society where people are objectified, where they are defined by their monetary value, those scary, predatory children will become these adults. Now that's the end of part 1 of this little video on money in A Christmas Carol. And in the second one, we're going to look at some alternative perspectives, particularly in the later part of the novel. Hopefully, though, that's been useful. And as ever, please do discuss any questions, any queries, any ideas with your teachers, who I'm sure will be more than happy to hear from you.